SoundCartel.
We've made it to 100 episodes. Time flies when you're doing a daily podcast. So we wanted to take a step back, reflect, and examine why so many people and brands are jumping onto the podcast bandwagon. What is, in fact, the power of podcasting? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. In the last 5 years, podcasting has had a meteoric rise in popularity among listeners and creators. And during COVID-19, it's even proven to be pandemic-proof. In this golden age of audio, brands too are getting involved in a big way. And why not? Why wouldn't you want to be where your audience is? But at its simplest, what is a podcast? Well, Nick Schildberger, my boss and Managing Director of SoundCartel, explains it as a series of spoken word or audio episodes that can be streamed or downloaded via the internet. And being on demand means that people can access it at a time convenient for them. Nick has been in the audio game for about 20 years. So, to celebrate this 100th episode milestone, I put him in the hot seat and began by asking him what the benefits are for businesses looking to start a podcast.
The first and I guess most important is that it's a great way to get awareness of your brand in the fastest growing medium of communication right now. Podcasts also give businesses the opportunity to take ownership of the market that they're highly skilled in, so thought leadership and owning that space. And all the while having those intimate conversations with their audience means they're going to build trust and loyalty with their customers over time. And in turn, that loyalty will hopefully, for existing customers, increase the rate of retention. And as they love your brand even more, then they're going to be more likely to refer other people to your business. You don't get that opportunity to have a long-form conversation with your audience like you do with audio and particularly with a podcast, which for some brands that might be a bit stuffy, gives them that opportunity to humanise their brand with their audience a little bit. The on-demand nature of podcasts also means that your audience can listen in a time that suits them. And they can multitask the audio, which again you can't do with videos or TV, for example. Which means you can listen in the car when you're driving, you can listen at the gym, out walking the dog. And these are the sorts of things that, again, other mediums just don't offer that flexibility.
Nick, podcasting has exploded in popularity over the last 5 years or so, but who exactly is listening to podcasts?
Everybody is listening to podcasts. They've actually been around for 15 years. I guess from a statistical point of view, we can look at the research done by Triton Digital and Edison Research each year in their Infinite Dial, which showed that awareness of podcasts in 2020 in Australia had increased to 87%. Now, usually we trail the US, but in that statistic we're actually ahead of the US, but still pretty good in the US, 75% up from 70%, and that's 212 million people that are aware of podcasts. As far as who's listened to podcasts, in Australia, it was an increase this year in the survey to 32% of Australians. And in the US, where we do lag a little bit in this one, they had their watershed moment last year with 51% of the population having ever listened to a podcast. And that's up this year to 55%, which again is 155 million people. So it's a huge audience and it's increasing rapidly every year.
So which businesses are currently doing podcasts really well?
There are more and more businesses doing good podcasts all the time now. Generally, when a business does a podcast, we refer to that as a branded podcast. And I guess I could refer to the winner of the best branded podcast at the Australian Podcast Awards last year, which was Tough Conversations with Henry Rollins. And that was a podcast produced by Mercedes. They drove around in a Mercedes, of course, having tough conversations with Henry Rollins. And it was a really entertaining podcast. It didn't matter that they were in a car. Of course, that was where the brand got mentioned. But it was an entertaining podcast, which is why it won the award. And it was great branding for Mercedes to attach themselves to that podcast. Another example of a big brand in Australia that has produced a very successful branded podcast is GE with their Decoding Genius. It won a number of awards, almost no branding at all from GE in the podcast. Again, they went for high production values, produce something that's really interesting and entertaining, and people know that it was produced by a GE, and for that we are thankful as listeners. An overseas example in the US would be Hackable, which was a branded podcast for McAfee. Again, a very entertaining podcast, quite subtle branding, but they've been in the top 1% of downloaded podcasts in the world with over 100,000 downloads per episode. So you can see there very quickly that if you do it well, a brand can get great results from a podcast.
Yeah.
And I guess it would be remiss of me not to mention a few of our own client podcasts, just quickly. We help the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons do a podcast each fortnight called Post-Op Podcast for their fellows, which is very informative. Also, on a similar vein of providing interesting information, we do a podcast for the Olive Wellness Institute, all about the health benefits of olives, also a fascinating podcast. And we produced a podcast for Officeworks, which was all about helping businesses overcome difficult moments in the life cycle of a business. Again, a branded podcast, but with lots of good information for their audience.
Now, you can be creative outside of a straight question and answer format. What other podcast formats can brands consider?
Well, there are now 1.2 million podcasts, probably more as I'm recording this right now. So there are so many different formats, whether they be educational, news, fiction, non-fiction, long form, short form. You can have niche podcasts for very small audiences and, of course, mass market. You mentioned that a simple form is the interview style, which is what we're doing right now. To step things up, you can use a more narrative style, which is more like a documentary where the host will be scripted, but you'll hear from several voices throughout the episode and the scripted host ties it all together. Higher production values, but it really helps with the pace and flow of a more professional feeling podcast. My advice, though, is just to be creative. Don't necessarily copy the last podcast that you listened to. If you're thinking about creating audio or a podcast, think about your audience, think about what they will enjoy, what they will find entertaining and informative, and then try and do it in a fun way.
Now, a podcast has to be good and enjoyable for people to listen to. So, in your opinion, what makes a good podcast?
Well, the number one thing is it needs to be entertaining. If I'm not going to be entertained, then I'm not going to put the headphones on to listen. There's a few things that go into that. First of all, it's understanding what your audience wants. To be entertaining and informative, you need to understand what that means to the person that you want to listen to your podcast. We also believe very highly in good quality audio. We've had a studio here for 30 years, and we try, if we can't get people into our studio, to link to other studios, because we believe that to respect the listener's time, you should produce the audio at the very highest quality you can. And that all comes back to also planning, so that you don't waste people's time when you're interviewing them. Do the research, think about the key messages you want to get across in your podcast, and that will make the recording process and the editing process much, much easier if you put that thought into the planning up front. And then once you've recorded the episode, make sure you edit properly. Cut out the waffle, the stuff that's not important, take it out. Again, respect the listener's time, edit it down to just the most important information in that podcast.
And now a very common question, Nick, that you'd probably be used to. How long should a podcast be?
I think that's the question we get asked the most here at SoundCartel.
It's true.
And it's quite simple. It just needs to be as long as it needs to be. Don't go on for an hour if you can do it in half an hour. Again, it comes back to the editing of the content as well. Editing is your friend. Edit once, edit twice, edit 3 times, and then when you think you can't edit any more out, maybe let someone else have a listen because they might find something that doesn't quite hit the mark and chop that out. We think there's a bit of a sweet spot around the sort of 15 to 20, maybe 25 minutes, less than a single commute, well, the average commute time, whatever that is. The stats say that the majority of podcasts under half an hour will be listened to in one session, and that's really important because you don't want to give people a reason to not come back to your podcast. So any time that they can listen all the way through in one session, I think is a good idea. Having said that, if you know your audience have the appetite for much, much longer form, 1 hour, 2 hour podcast, then by all means go on and make longer form content if that's what you think your audience is going to enjoy.
Now, how important is frequency to podcasting?
It's really important. Frequency and consistency of releasing your episodes is really important. We're creatures of habit, and so your listeners will get into a routine. So if you start off by releasing a weekly podcast every Tuesday, then try and do it at the same time every Tuesday, because your listeners will expect that regularity. The more often you can produce a podcast, it's likely that you'll grow an audience faster. So if you can do it weekly, you'll probably grow your audience faster than doing it fortnightly, and likewise fortnightly faster than doing it monthly. Having said that, you have to be able to maintain the schedule. You need to be able to commit to producing a high quality podcast every time. Again, that comes back to respecting the listener. So if you can't do it weekly, then do it fortnightly. If you can't do it fortnightly, do it monthly. And of course, you could always do it daily, like we are right now. And on that note, I'd actually like to turn the tables on you, Nicole, and ask you how it's going hosting Business Essentials Daily. And of course, congratulations on this, our 100th episode.
Oh, thanks, Nick. Yes, it's our 100th episode. Nothing teaches you more about consistency than doing a daily podcast. I feel really honoured to have the opportunity to take on the role as host and co-producer. It's such an exciting time for podcasting that to be on the journey with the business as the industry is growing rapidly really is a dream come true. So very excited to have reached this milestone of 100 episodes, which, for some people and some podcasts is not a huge amount, and for others it's Everest. So we're going to continue to produce the show, and we love doing it. So now turning the tables back around, once a business has created a great podcast, how do they market it?
Yeah, marketing is one of the probably most underrated parts of the podcast process. A lot of our clients think that when they've produced the audio and they've got the MP3 in their hot little hand, that's basically the job done. Well, it's not. And we say it's about half the job. It's almost like a new job starts again in the marketing, because if you don't tell people about your podcast, you're not going to grow an audience. Yeah, back at that planning stage, look at your owned media, things like your databases, your own website, your social media, newsletters, events, anywhere that you'll be able to promote that podcast once it's launched. The ABC in their podcast survey revealed that 71% of podcast discoverability is done by word of mouth, followed by 58% via recommendation in other podcasts and 48% on social media. So again, it's all about getting that word out, telling as many people as possible that your podcast exists. You can, of course, spend money on ads in podcasts. Host-read ads in other podcasts are really successful. Boosting social media and other sort of more traditional forms of marketing will all help get awareness of your podcast out there.
And final question, Nick. If a business is looking to start a podcast, what's the first thing they should do?
Well, they should sit down and work out what their audio strategy is. Now, audio strategy might be a bit of a strange concept for some people listening, but with podcasting being so popular and growing so fast, you're probably going to be behind the eight ball if you're not at least considering having some form of audio in your strategy. As you all know, Nicole, it's all about having that 360-degree marketing solution, and audio can play a really important part in that. It's not the only thing you should do, but it is becoming, a much more important ingredient as that audience is growing and growing every day. So start with the strategy. It's very important to know what the purpose of your podcast is. Why are you doing it? And who is it for? Without those two critical ingredients, there's no point moving on to the next phase of what the content is, the format, the tone of voice, how you're going to produce it, the distribution, the marketing. All those things should go into the strategy for creating your podcast. And then once you've got that, you get down to the fun part, which is producing it. And then, as we just said, moving on to the amplification and marketing and growing that audience of really passionate listeners. But above all, have fun with it.
That was SoundCartel Managing Director, Nick Schildberger. Business Essentials Daily is a SoundCartel podcast. Executive producer is Heather Dawson. Producers are Nick Schildberger, Chris Ashmore, and myself. Technical production by Pete Letts and Belinda Trimboli. I'm Nicole Goodman. Thanks for listening. We'll bring you more Be Daily next week. SoundCartel.